As the effects of climate change are becoming better understood, so too are the vulnerabilities to those events of buildings like museums that house civilization's history. Joining us today to discuss new approaches to space planning and resilience for museums is Andrew Barwick, a senior associate with the architecture firm Cooper Robertson, whose design portfolio includes several museum projects. Welcome to the weekly, Andrew.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me.
Hmm. Let's get right into it. What are the critical risks that museums are facing, and what are some of your firm's strategies to counter those risks?
So I think a couple that come to mind are, firstly, climate change, with regards to flood mitigation, obviously, for museums that might be at low-lying or close to sea level, but also not just flood mitigation, but also wildfires, obviously. I think, the Getty Museum comes to mind as a recent institution that suffered, a bit from wildfires. I think it's really across the range in terms of climate change. It's not simply just assessment based on proximity to sea level. I think it's really across the board. A second one is managing risks in terms of physical security. In terms of access control, obviously theft deterrence, also, ballistic and blast proofing, which can be, a project requirement for museums oftentimes, depending on their collections. But I mean, there are, well-established approaches for, doing a needs-based or risk-based assessment on how to deal with those risks. It's not something that we're unused to. It's quite common, in fact, and it's always part of the conversation during these projects. I think, what's prominent on everyone's mind right now is, kind of the wholesale assessment in light of COVID that is really, causing most institutions to kind of look at, visitor capacity, circulation flow, air
Mm,
handling, hygiene, all of the above, whether, they're established institution or, they're in the planning phases for an expansion. It's kind of affecting everyone across the board. And we're, at a really interesting moment in time right now where we're having those discussions. I mean, there aren't presently, established metrics that can kind of we can benchmark against to kind of establish effectiveness against COVID. We have other metrics that we can use to kind of get a sense of where we are, in terms of like MERV filtration
mm.
and so forth. But museums are huge consumers of energy, and increasing the air handling requirements just introduces new pressures on these institutions in terms of mechanical equipment, power requirements, emergency power requirements, as well as financial pressures as well. I mean, we're at a time when a lot of institutions are seeing decrease in cash flow, and so how to build this into their capital budget or operational budget is a really big challenge right now for everyone across the board, I think. And we're having those conversations where we're looking at things in terms of risk-based assessment of really what we can get for our money, how much efficacy can we get with some of these moves that gives us some surety of the safety of patrons, because at the end of the day, we want to get back to a time when we're seeing increased visitorship to these institutions. We want these institutions to reestablish themselves as pillars within their communities, and in order to get back to that time right now, we really have to have these kind of hard discussions about how this money can be spent to really preserve the safety of everyone using the building.
Hmm. Your firm recently released a white paper on the topic of flood mitigation for museums and used the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York as a case study. Can you summarize for our viewers the problem and solution this study explores?
Uh, Certainly, yeah. So, I mean, the approach to resiliency on that project actually started during the design phase before Superstorm Sandy hit. I mean, just really prompted by the proximity of the project site to the Hudson River, the low elevation of the project site, So it's all, it was already part of the discussions during the planning phases of design, and it kind of resulted in a couple of fundamental initial moves, like not having any collection storage within the cellar or ground floor of the building. All of the galleries start at the 5th floor of the building and go up. Also, the art handling and uncrating spaces are also on the 5th floor. So, getting those activities, kind of away from grade and getting them elevated was kind of foundational, and getting the project and the design of the project at a good point before Superstorm Sandy hit. When it did hit, it kind of, it happened at a, maybe serendipitous point in the project, where foundations were in, some of the cellar mechanical equipment was being installed, but it happened early enough in the project during construction when the project team could kind of pull back and assess, well, what do we need to do here? Obviously, we needed to inspect the, structure that had been installed, and, to date, the mechanical equipment, the electrical equipment that had been installed, to, ensure that, things were not corroding from contact with seawater. But beyond that, it really prompted, the trustees of the museum to pull back and say, what can we do to ensure that the building is flood-proof. So that prompted an international search for an engineering consultant that had a specialty in flood mitigation. And
Andrew, who was that, Andrew? Do you recall?
That was WTM. They're a German engineering firm based in Hamburg. And they really started a kind of a risk-based assessment to chart the probability and magnitude of future severe storm events, and really the level of hardening that would be required for each projected or forecasted scenario. So that allowed the team to kind of evaluate kind of the level of hardening required, and then help establish a budget for, okay, what are we getting for our money? How much surety are we having? And are we testing for a 100-year storm event, 500-year storm event? Where are we getting to? So they did a lot of computational modeling. They did, a wave flume physical model to test storm surge conditions. They incorporated data from FEMA and NOAA. But at the time, I think it's worth pointing out that that FEMA was not incorporating climate change data into their, flood projections. So that was like an additional factor that WTM pulled in to account for gradual sea level rise as a result of climate change, to kind of give us a little bit surety. And we actually, I think at the time, after post Superstorm Sandy, FEMA said, we need, 13.5 feet above sea level is the datum that you have to get to. And that seemed almost, too much of a risk for the Whitney and the greater project team. And so WTM actually kind of elevated that to, I believe the end datum was 17 feet 6 inches, if I'm remembering correctly. So quite a bit higher than what had been kind of the guidance of FEMA.
Beyond risk mitigation, what are some of the other trends in museum design that your company is either seeing or is actually practicing itself?
I think the big one is sort of greater porosity. I think in museum design, and this goes back to contemporary social justice and equity movements that are ongoing right now, and which is prompting museums to look at how can they become participants or greater participants in their communities at large. How can they engage and support these movements? Traditionally museums have been seen as, kind of a vault or temple of culture, kind of closed off, to the streetscape. And that, there's been a good rationale for that in terms of, climactic considerations for sensitive works of art, ultraviolet light, so forth. But with advances in glass technology, we've been able to kind of mitigate that and be able to get around it. So museums have begun to open up to the public and allow greater engagement, and that even extends to like a programming level where museums are beginning to offer community spaces that are free and open to the public, ground floor galleries that are free and open to the public, that sort of thing. So that's, these movements I think are actually beginning to really truly manifest in the physical, built environment of these buildings.
Does that lend to the building's resilience as well?
Um, that's an interesting question. I think, if you're devoting, your ground floor space, to community events, and you're kind of elevating all of the works of art to, the second floor or higher, certainly. I mean, that's, similar to the Whitney model, but also, or in Princeton, which is a, project that we're collaborating with presently with Ajay Associates. Previously, the museum, the collections of the museum had kind of a hierarchy where Eurocentric collections were, and American collections were on the second floor, and then African and Asian collections of artwork were on the ground floor. And so it had kind of an upstairs, downstairs sort of rationale to it, which, is interesting. But so one of the big moves that the team at Ajay Associates did which was kind of fundamental to the design of the building, is to elevate the African and Asian collections and get everything up onto the second floor. So that hierarchy of culture becomes flattened in a way, and then the ground floor becomes devoted towards these community and social spaces. So yeah, I think to your question, I think there's definitely a linkage there for sure.
You mentioned that the Princeton University Art Museum, you're working with Ajay Associates, and it's not uncommon for museum projects to have multiple design firms at work collaborating. But that's, like I said, it's not unusual for museums, but it's unusual for other typologies. Tell me a little bit about how that collaboration works.
It's fun. We're used to it. We're comfortable in that mode. There's obviously, fee considerations of why, it's kind of economically beneficial for projects to be developed in this way. But when we get into the scale and complexity of these projects, it really becomes beneficial where we kind of are able to draw on each other's knowledge across the range with, Ajay's sort of, design wisdom and input, of course, and kind of drive. And then, we have, extensive experience in museum design, that allows us to, not only kind of grapple with the, complex technical requirements of the project, but also, we have, kind of a, back history or back catalog of projects that we've worked on that we can use as kind of research for basis on best practices, benchmarking, that can all be fed into the design of these buildings. And it's also, I have to say, it's typically, a back and forth conversation. It's not a handoff, where the project is developed from schematic design through design development and then is handed off to us by the design architect. That's typically not how we work. We're kind of involved from the germinal stages of a project at schematic design, and we offer our input in terms of code compliance, museum practices, all of the above that are kind of, again, fed into the design and out to kind of develop in sync with, the design intent of the design architect. And for us, it's fun. We learn stuff from the other architects that we work with, and hopefully, they learn stuff from us, and it's a mutually beneficial sort of partnership.
Mm-hmm. Well, Andrew, thanks for sharing a couple minutes of your time today. I really appreciate it. Wish you good luck to the remainder of the year. And again, thanks for our audience for listening. This is John Caulfield from Building, Design, and Construction.